My name is John Goldsmith, and I'd like to talk to you about a book that I published recently in 2019, along with Bernard Lax, a friend and a colleague from the University of Paris. The book is called Battle in the Minefields, and there are several points that we try to make in this book, and I'd like to talk to you about them over a sequence of videos. The book can, in the first place, be viewed as a history of what we call the mind sciences. And in this volume, we concentrate on linguistics, philosophy, logic, and psychology. So, as I say, the book certainly can be read as a history of these four disciplines. At the same time, it's a plea for why it's so important to look at the history of our discipline. And then in a third place, it's an exploration of why our current understanding of the history of our field is as poor as it is. So let me say a little bit about each of these points. In the first place, as I say, the book can be read as a history. We originally intended to focus on the 20th century, in part because it was our way of coming to grips with the fact that we understood our own history, our own professional and disciplinary history, so poorly when we began. And we felt that we needed to go back and get a clear picture of the 20th century in these fields, especially linguistics. But when we went back to the beginning of the 20th century, it became perfectly clear you couldn't understand what was happening in the early 20th century if you didn't understand what had happened a generation or two earlier in the 19th century. And of course, it goes back, and we had to draw a line somewhere. And so basically, we said we'll start around 1800 or a little bit after that. So the book is an exploration of linguistics, psychology, logic, and philosophy in ways that come together and have an impact on the way we understand language now, today. And over the course of these videos, I'll look at each of the chapters that focus on individual disciplines and the historical context in which these disciplines were developing. So then the second question is, why is it so important to understand the history of our field and our neighboring fields? Why is it important to study the history of the disciplines that we care about? You know, the traditional argument against studying the history is that if we look at work in the past and we look at the conclusions people have drawn, they're either true or they're false. If they're false, why would it possibly be of interest to us today to study things that we've established are false? On the other hand, if they're true, those truths are almost undoubtedly already factored in, already built into the later theories that we have today. Well, that's not the right way to look at to look at things. The reason that we study the disciplines in the past is not to look at the conclusions that they draw, but rather to look at the questions that they're asking and that they're developing. And why do we care about the questions? Because we are trying to understand the questions that we ask today. It's very hard to do so, and it's very hard to understand the questions of the times that we are living in. And by going back and looking at the disciplines in the past, we see the questions in a kind of a more raw way, and we better understand the questions that motivated workers in the past, and we see how those questions evolved into what they may be today. A way to put this in a single pithy statement is you don't understand an answer until you understand what the question is that it's an answer to. And the best and at least the easiest way to understand a question is to look at how it was formulated and how it was formulated in the past, especially earlier on. So that's a big part of why we do what we do. And when we look at questions, when we discover or uncover questions in this way, we see that there are questions of various different sorts. Some are fairly superficial and kind of very tightly linked to a particular context. Others are very deep and oftentimes difficult to elucidate, difficult to shed light upon them and to articulate them. And then many questions are in between. And it can be of great interest to us to see how deep questions can be shared by neighboring disciplines, and to see as well how questions can pop from one discipline to another, and sometimes take on a different shape and a different form when they move from one discipline to another. So these are some of the important aspects of the work that we're trying to do and to share with you over the course of this book. Well, by their very nature, it's difficult to explain a deep idea in 30 or 60 seconds or whatever time we have available to us here. But I'll try nonetheless. One of the deepest and most important ideas, we spend a lot of time in Battle in the Minefields laying the groundwork for understanding this. One of the deepest questions is, to what extent can we understand the power of the mind in a way that it does not involve human subjectivity, that does not involve will or awareness? And that's a question that has engaged many thinkers, philosophers, logicians, mathematicians in the past, and it has come up and captured the imagination of linguists in the context of generative grammar. Noam Chomsky was really clear on this point in the late 1950s through the 60s, and he's continued being clear about this up to the present day. He wants to develop a theory of grammar, of natural language, of human language, which does not depend in any fashion on human subjectivity. Now, certainly when I got excited about generative grammar in the first place, which was in the late 1960s, I understood that. I certainly didn't understand the context in which that question was important. I thought it was an interesting challenge to go ahead and work within the context of such a question, but I didn't understand the larger context, that's for sure. Today, as I look out at my colleagues in linguistics, I think that this idea that we want to explain language in a way that does not involve human subjectivity in any way is probably a minority view, and I think probably a majority view would be to say, well, what we're interested in about language is how human beings use it, what they intend to accomplish when they use it, and their conceptions of who they are themselves and who they're talking to, and why would we want to focus on a side of language which can be explained only if we dispense of all human subjectivity? Well, indeed, that's a good question, and it's something that we explore here. But these are the deep questions which rarely get asked as such in the context of particular linguistic research. But it gives rise to generative grammar as a huge movement. And so that's a simple answer to the question, why do we study the past? So that we can understand the present. So we can understand the questions of the present by looking at the questions of the past. One of the lessons of history that comes up again and again in the discussion that you find in our book and in these videos is that you don't understand a movement unless you understand how it is that it appealed to so many young, smart people in its day. This is really important. There are some movements in the past, and behaviorism is a really good example. But then again, so is Bloomfieldianism. There are many movements which today, for one reason or another, people find it very easy to poo-poo them and to say at least that there was really nothing of much interest in what was going on then. And that's really a sign that the person who's making those comments hasn't read it, doesn't understand it. If we don't understand what it was about a particular approach or movement in the past, if we don't understand what it was that got young people excited about it, then we haven't understood what it was about. This is something that happens over and over again. We see it clearly in the rise of behaviorism, for example, which basically started around 1910 in the United States, We see this when Bar Hillel talks about how excited he was in reading the work of Rudolf Carnap and other people of the Vienna Circle in the mid-1930s. We find it in the generative semanticists. We find it time and time again. There's actually another point that goes along with it. There's a sense often of a great deal of a burden having been taken off the shoulders of the young people who came to embrace a new approach. There's a feeling, as I say, of a burden being removed from their shoulders, and the importance of basically getting rid of all of the false knowledge of the past. So this is something that's really interesting, and it gives us a better insight, really gives us a better insight into the present just as it helps us understand the past. So we're going to take a look at an example now. We don't have to go so far back in time. We're going to take a look at an example now, and we'll see any number of cases of it down the road. Let me give you an example of the kind of, well, I don't have a better word than rhetoric at the moment, but the kind of talk that characterizes this. And the example I'm going to give is not one where I've had to reach into the past, but the feeling is exactly the same in this passage as it is in many, many of the other passages that we'll encounter from the past. This is from Noam Chomsky, and he wrote the following. The whole history of grammar for thousands of years had been a history of rules and constructions and transformational grammar. In the early days, generative grammar just took that over. So the early generative grammar had a very traditional flair. There's a section on passive in German and another on the VP in Japanese and so on. It essentially took over the traditional framework, tried to make it precise, asked new questions, and so on. What happened in the PISA discussions was that the whole framework was turned upside down. So from that point of view, there's nothing left of the whole traditional approach to the structure of language other than taxonomic artifacts. And that's a radical change, and it was a very liberating one. It was a very liberating one. The principles that were suggested were, of course, wrong. Parametric choices were unclear, and so on. But the way of looking at things was totally different from anything that had come before. And it opened the way to an enormous explosion of research in all sorts of areas, typologically very varied. It initiated a period of great excitement in the field. In fact, I think it's fair to say that more has been learned about language in the last 20 years than in the preceding 2,000 years. Wow. Tremendous feeling of liberation and excitement. And that's great. But the young people in every movement felt exactly the same way. And if we want to understand what's good about a movement, we've got to understand what it is that makes people, and I'm going to repeat it again, young people, be the driver of a new set of ideas, of a new movement in any of these intellectual disciplines. There's another aspect of this that we've seen already in that quotation from Noam Chomsky, and that is the importance of establishing a clean sweep of what we used to think that we know or that we knew. Let me go back, 80 years or so, and read you, something very similar from Bertrand Russell, great philosopher, very influential philosopher. Two quotations here. But Galileo's few facts suffice to destroy the whole vast system of supposed knowledge handed down from Aristotle, as even the palest sun suffices to extinguish the stars. So in philosophy, though some have believed one system and others another, almost all have been of the opinion that a great deal was known. But all this supposed knowledge in the traditional system must be swept away, and a new beginning must be made, and we shall esteem fortunate indeed if it can attain results comparable to Galileo's law of falling bodies. And then Russell ended the book with the following. The one and only condition, I believe, which is necessary in order to secure for philosophy in the near future an achievement surpassing all that has hitherto been accomplished by philosophers is the creation of a school of men with scientific training and philosophical interests, unhampered by the traditions of the past and not misled by the literary methods of those who copy ancients in all except their merits. Okay, this clarion call was heard by the young Rudolf Carnap, important Austrian philosopher. We get to this in chapter 7. And he wrote, "Some passages have an especially vivid impression on me because they formulated clearly and explicitly a view of the aim and method of philosophy which I had implicitly held for some time. I felt as if this appeal had been directed to me personally. To work in this spirit would be my task from now on!" Exclamation point. And indeed, henceforth, the application of this new logical instrument for the purposes of analyzing scientific concepts and clarifying philosophical problems has been the essential aim of my philosophical activity. We spend a good deal of the rest of chapter 1 talking about the importance of understanding linguists, philosophers, and so forth, as members of groups, as they themselves perceive themselves as members of groups. Let me give you an example, a very striking example by Isaiah Berlin, a wonderful raconteur, a Russian-British philosopher, who talked about what Oxford philosophy was like when he was a young man. And he wrote, "One of the shortcomings of these meetings is something that seems to me to apply to Oxford philosophy in general, at least in those days. We were excessively self-centered. The only persons whom we wished to convince were our own admired colleagues. There was no pressure upon us to publish. Consequently, when we succeeded in gaining from one of our philosophical peers acceptance or even understanding of some point which we regarded as original and important, whether rightly or, as was more often the case, at any rate with me, in a state of happy delusion, this satisfied us completely, too completely. We felt no need to publish our ideas, for the only audience which was worth satisfying was the handful of our contemporaries who lived near us and with whom we met with agreeable regularity." This is so important. We speak, we listen, we write with an understanding that we are coming from, that we form part of a particular group. And this realization is important in everything that we say in the rest of the book. We're members of groups, and that's how we present ourselves in our conversations, in our teaching, and in our writing. And so this leads us to focus on three particular notions that play a role. One is generations, the second is authority, and the third is a kind of a fierce fighting word, ideology, which I'll say just a little bit about. Generations play a very important role in what we talk about in Battle in the Minefields. We see over and over again the importance of the notion of generation. So what are we talking about when we say when we talk about generations? So generations is to some degree something that can be defined in terms of time, but fundamentally being in a certain generation, what people share when we say that they're in a generation is a common set of experiences, and experiences as lived by a person of a particular age. So just to take an example, for me, I'm of the Vietnam generation as far as Americans are concerned. I'm a member of the group by age, and in my case as well by gender, of people who had to think very seriously about the possibility of being drafted and sent to fight in the American War in Vietnam. So this is a set of experiences that I shared with people of my age. And this is a very important notion in understanding intellectual history as well, the generations that organize the people and the thoughts of a given time. The notion of generation is closely related to the relation of teacher and student as well. another notion that plays a big role. And in fact, is going to play a big role in some of the diagrams that I'll show you. The relationship between a teacher and a student in an academic context is extremely important. It's a relationship that can be very helpful for both the teacher and the student. The student learns a great deal, hopefully, in a successful relationship with a teacher. And the student eventually has to, in some sense, go off on their own, find their own ideas, try to define in their own heads how their own ideas relate to those of their teacher. Do they go beyond? Do they reject? Do they go off in a completely different direction? These are the challenges that face any student who wants to go ahead and become an independent thinker after going through the formation of study with a teacher. And the various ways in which this happens, the kinds of outcomes that we can observe in the student-teacher relationship, constitute an important and rich set of histories that we can learn from. Probably the most influential sociologist who has written on the concept of generation is Karl Mannheim, who wrote, "Any two generations following one another always fight different opponents, both within and without. While the older people may still be combating something in themselves or in the external world in such fashion that all their feelings and efforts, and even their concepts and categories of thoughts, are determined by that adversary. For the younger people, this adversary may be simply non-existent. Their primary orientation is an entirely different one. That historical development does not proceed in a straight line, a feature frequently observed, particularly in the cultural sphere, is largely attributed to this shifting of the polar components of life, that is, to the fact that internal or external adversaries constantly disappear and are replaced by others." So there's at least two really important points to take home from this very brief introduction to the concept of generation. One is that there's a special relationship between the teacher and the student, and the other is that there's a special relationship shared by people all of the same generation. These are both very important forces in the constitution of the Society of Scholars that we'll be looking at over the course of this book. One of the ideas we discuss in Chapter 1 is the following, that every time that an individual, a person, interacts in a professional way, they present themselves as members of a group. And any such group has to be defined in a particular way. So we need to explore these in-group definitions. And let me give you a simple example. It's a really clear example. I'm not going to tell you first who it is who says it. It's somebody who actually becomes important in Chapter 7 of the book later on. So the author, after stating what he intended to do in his book, turned to the question of how his work related to the work of others, and he made the following observation. The basic orientation and the line of thought of this book are not properly an achievement of the author alone, but belong to a certain scientific atmosphere which is neither created nor maintained by any single individual. End quote. Well, of course, that means it's a group, and scientific activities are normally groups. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit from the text here. Today, we might paraphrase this by saying that knowledge is a social good that we share rather than the possession of an individual. But when we say that, who is the we that we have in mind when we say that we share it? All right, back to this author whose name I haven't told you yet. The thoughts which I have written down here are supported by a group of active or receptive collaborators. Okay, so he's part of a group. He's going to say something about them. He explained that the members of the group had, quote, had in common especially a certain basic scientific orientation. In fact, this smaller group was as much as anything defined by what it had found, tested, and deemed to be no good at all in other philosophers' work. And as for the group's own work, the fact that it rejected a traditional philosophy, quote, is only a negative characteristic, he wrote. And then he went on. The positive features are more important. It's not easy to describe them, but I shall try to give a loose characterization. So at this point, he goes on to describe some of the specific characteristics of the group that he's a member of. And he wrote, "The new type of philosophy has arisen in close contact with the work of the special sciences." Here, special sciences just means particular sciences, especially mathematics and physics. Consequently, members of the group have taken the strict and responsible orientation of the scientific investigator as their guideline for philosophical work, while the attitude of the traditional philosopher is more like that of the poet. His group's members did science, and they didn't associate with people who thought like poets. And he goes on, "This new attitude not only changes the style of thinking, but also the type of problem that's posed." And nothing could be more important than understanding what the principles are that define the questions that we look at in all of the disciplines that we're looking at here. That's really central. And I said a little while ago that what's so important if we want to understand what we do in linguistics or psychology or philosophy, you name it, is we have to not only understand the answers, but understand the questions to which they are the answers. And what we're seeing here is a clear recognition that developing a framework means providing principles that determine what the questions are. You decide what the questions are. It almost doesn't matter who decides what the answers are. The questions are really critical and essential and terribly important. The person who wrote that was actually a very young Rudolf Carnap, who was in the 1920s and into the 1930s, was an important and active member of the Vienna Circle, developing logical positivism, and that group and the people and their ideas play a really important role in Battle in the Minefields. We'll come back to this in later chapters. Linguists have been concerned about the scientific status of their profession for a long time. Let's take a look at some of the things that people have been saying that linguistics is finally a science now. And we can find people saying this going back, well, let's start with 1838. Josiah Willard Gibbs wrote in 1838, "Since the commencement of the present century," well, so we're talking 1800 now, "and especially within the last 15 years, so now we're talking, 1820 or so, the philosophy of language has been pursued with great ardor, and the learned on the continent of Europe, by following the grand Baconian principle of induction, have placed this science on a solid basis and are in the way of most important discoveries. These discoveries are modifying the grammars and the lexicons of every language. The new method of grammar has a thorough and proper unity because it commences with the proposition as the central point. The value of each word and of every form is made to depend on their relation to the proposition. This develops the organic relations of language and gives to the new method a scientific form. The new method, of course, is the same for all languages. Different languages may all be analyzed in the same way." All right, let's skip forward 20 years to the very important historian of science and philosopher of science, William Whewell, who wrote in 1858, "Another science cultivated with great zeal and success in modern times compares the languages of different countries and nations, and by an examination of their materials and structure, endeavors to determine their descent from one another. This science has been called comparative philology or ethnography, and by the French, linguistique, a word which we might imitate in order to have a single name for the science, but the Greek derivative glossology appears to be more convenient in its form." Whewell was the person who created the word scientist. Moving ahead, Max Müller, who is a very influential German-British linguist, wrote in 1862, "The science of language is a science of very modern date. We cannot trace its lineage much beyond the beginning of our century," that is, again, back to 1800, "and it is scarcely received as yet on a footing of equality by the elder branches of learning. We hear it spoken of as comparative philology, scientific etymology, phonology, and glossology. In France it has received the convenient but somewhat barbarous name of linguistique. We do not want to know languages. We want to know language, what language is, how it can form a vehicle or an organ of thought. We want to know its origin, its nature, its laws. And it is only in order to arrive at that knowledge that we collect, arrange, and classify all the facts of language that are within our reach. William Dwight Whitney was a very important linguist around the same period. He was the first great American linguist. And he wrote about this as well. He wrote in 1867, he wrote, "Those who are engaged in the investigation of language have but recently begun to claim for their study the rank and title of a science. Its development as such has been wholly the work of the present century." Again, just to remind you, we're talking the 19th century. "Although its germs go back to a much more ancient date. It has had a history, in fact, not unlike that of the other sciences of observation and induction, for example, geology, chemistry, astronomy, physics, which the intellectual activity of modern times has built up upon the scanty observations and crude inductions of modern days." There's a very nice passage written by the German linguist August Schleicher. Let me read some of it to you. This is from 1871. He wrote, "Grammar forms one part of the science of language. This science is itself part of the natural history of man. Its method is in substance that of natural sciences generally. It consists in accurate investigation of our object and in conclusions founded upon that investigation. One of the chief problems of the science of language is the inquiry into and the description of the classes of language or speech systems, that is, of the languages which are derived from one and the same original tongue, and the rearrangement of these classes according to a natural system." I'll skip a sentence or two. "By grammar, we mean the scientific comprehension and explanation of the sound, the form, the function of words and their parts, and the construction of sentences. Grammar, therefore, treats of the knowledge of sounds, or phonology, of forms, or morphology, of functions, or the science of meaning and relation, and syntax. The subject of grammar may be language in general, or one particular language or group of languages. Grammar may be universal or special." William Dwight Whitney again wrote in 1865, "Great progress has been made in phonological science during the past score or two of years, and it is hardly too much to say that the mode of production of the ordinary articulate sounds composing human language is now understood in all its main features." Well, we actually had a lot more to learn after Whitney, but he certainly did a lot. Ferdinand de Saussure wrote something similar. In 1891, he wrote, "Here is the objection, which we take to be more or less well-grounded. You transform the study of languages into the study of language, with a capital L, of language as considered as a human faculty, as one of the distinctive signs of its species, as an anthropological or even zoological character. The most elementary phenomena of language will not be suspected or clearly noticed, classified, and understood if we do not insist on the study of languages from the beginning to end. Language and languages, which I've translated from langue and langage, are one thing. One is the generalization of the other. If you want to study language without undertaking the effort to study the quite evident diversity of what is found in languages, your effort will be in vain. On the other hand, if you want to study languages but lose track of the fact that in their very nature these languages are governed by certain principles of language, your work will be even more bereft of serious significance and of all real scientific basis." There's a very interesting historian, his name was John Mertz's book here. I want to read you a little bit of what Mertz wrote in 1903. He wrote, "A new science called phonetics or phonology has sprung up and is now universally admitted to have created the modern science of language. In addition to this physiological and physical basis, the superstructure of the science of language has likewise been stated to be no longer a historical or philosophical, but to have become a physical science." He goes on. In a footnote, he wrote, "In the modern science of language, we have one among the many cases where a historical or philosophical science is becoming an exact science by attaching itself to physics and physiology." In the first issue of the Journal of Language, Leonard Bloomfield wrote, "The layman, natural scientist, philologian, or man in the street does not know that there is a science of language. Such a science, however, exists. Its aims are so well defined, its methods so well developed, and its past results so copious that students of language feel as much need for a professional society as do adherents of any other science." Nikolai Trubetskoy, a few years later, in 1933, he wrote, "At the present time, phonology is characterized by its structuralism and its systematic universalism. This direction of thought can be seen in physics, in chemistry, in biology, in psychology, in the economic sciences, etc. Phonology is thus not isolated. It is part of a broader scientific movement." William Chomsky, in 1945, wrote the Kimian, that is the approach of David Kimi. The Kimian theory placed the study of Hebrew phonetics on a scientific basis. Bernard Bloch, looking back at Bloomfield's work, wrote, "There can be no doubt that Bloomfield's greatest contribution to the study of language was to make a science of it. Others before him had worked scientifically in linguistics, but no one had so uncompromisingly rejected all pre-scientific methods or had been so consistently careful in writing about language to use terms that would imply no tacit reference on factors beyond the range of observation." Piatelli Palmerini, in 1998, wrote, "Minimalist grammar is well on its way to becoming a full-blown natural science, offering a serious promise of an advanced field of scientific inquiry whose idealizations, abstractions, and deductions will eventually match in depth and subtlety those of the most advanced domains of modern science. Generative grammar is turning into a natural science already because of what is now, not because of what it might one day turn into." Peter Kulikover and Andrei Novak wrote in 2003, "In spite of its antiquity as an object of human inquiry, linguistics as a science in the modern sense is very young. It was only in the last century, and by that they mean the 20th century, that the study of language moved beyond observation and superficial description to attempts to explain why human language is the way it is. The primary impetus for this dramatic and revolutionary shift was the work of Chomsky 57, Chomsky 65. And Boats and Piatelli Palmerini wrote in 2007, "We are among those who are persuaded, on solid grounds we think, that in the past 50 years, linguistics has progressively established itself as a genuinely scientific discipline." So I hope that you're convinced now that it's not difficult to document the notion that for the last 200 years, linguists have always been convinced that linguistics has been a science. In fact, it's been a science for about 20 years or so. And I hope that this view, that this kind of cross-historical view, gives you a little bit of a desire to go back with us to understand how linguistics and its neighboring fields have evolved and how they have shared with each other their understanding of a deeper scientific and philosophical conception of what language is and how it works. I'll see you next week. We'll talk about Chapter 2.